4 years ahead of schedule. So that was obviously around COP in Paris, and the most ambitious aim of the Paris Agreement being to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So we immediately started looking at and working with Andy and the Carbon Trust at what a 1.5 degree pathway target for BT would look like. This meant an 87% reduction in our carbon emissions intensity by 2030, and we announced this target in 2017. And following the publication of the IPCC report, we also announced a target to be a net zero emissions business by 2045. Just a quick overview on our targets, and I spent quite a bit of time talking both internally and externally about targets, because the targets that we have really helped drive BT's business and changes in the business and behavior. So we've, for example, recently announced that 10% of BT manager remuneration bonus remuneration going forward will be based on us meeting a digital skills target and being on the right pathway to meet our 87% 2030 reduction target. We have an abatement target to help our customers reduce their carbon emissions by at least 3 times the end-to-end carbon impact of our business. And when I talk about end-to-end, I mean end-to-end. So upstream supply chain, our own operations, and customer using our product. We met that target early, actually. We're now at 3.1 to 1, and we've helped customers avoid about 13 million tons of carbon. I think importantly for the business, this is now also 5.5 billion of BT's total revenues. We've set a target for supply chain, which is aligned to a 1.5 degree pathway, and that's to reduce our emissions by 42% by 2030. Then the net zero carbon emissions target that I mentioned as well. We've also found these targets very important in talking to government and to the market. It tends to inspire others to set similar targets. You know, it gives confidence to the UK government that large companies are setting net zero targets, and that allows them to be more ambitious. So the UK government has a target to be net zero by 2050, for example. And obviously, as we know, when we talk about targets like 100% renewables, that inspires confidence in the market and in the renewables market. And we're hoping that companies joining together in initiatives like RE100 or EV100 would just lead to those changes in supply in the market if we can show more demand. So coming on to the next slide, our end-to-end carbon footprint. So I think as most of the companies in our sector, the biggest area we have here by far is purchased goods and services at 49%, use of sold products 24%. We use a spend-based methodology for supply chain and a process-based methodology for use of sold products and manufacturing of purchased goods. Now, I don't know, Andy, if you want to say anything more about our approach and our approach to setting these targets or our methodologies.
Yeah, so I mean, as Gabrielle says, the biggest impact here is the purchase goods and services, and that's typical for most telecoms companies. So everything that you buy part of your supply chain, and that's usually quite tricky to also estimate. So the usual way that it is, as Gabrielle says, that BT is looking at a spend base, so you look at how much you spend on different product categories and allocate an emission factor which is related to that category spend. So inevitably that uses a sort of generic approach of averages, and you can improve that sort of slightly by looking at life cycle emissions of some of the products that you buy. So I think BT have looked at that and some supplier specific ones, but generally the number of suppliers that you have is in the telecoms industry is so large that it's difficult to almost impossible to get that granularity of data there, which in some other sectors is maybe more possible where they have a smaller product base or a simpler supply chain. So that's probably the key area. And then on the downstream side, the use of sold products is the main category there, that and for BT that's showing at 24% of their total scope 1, 2 and 3. And that you can be sort of slightly more specific at looking. So what BT do is they take all of the products that they sell, quite a detailed approach of categorizing those into not only different types of products, so handsets, routers, set-top boxes, other devices, CPE, but also breaking those down into model names and then looking at what the energy consumption of those individual models is and multiplying it by the lifetime of the product and then the emission factor. And for BT, most of the customers are based in the UK, so they use the UK emission factor. For some of you, obviously, where you operate in multiple geographies, then you also need to take account of where the equipment's being used. So those generally the two main categories. I mean, the other one, which probably Andy Murray will talk about, is where you've got joint ventures, can be quite big, and that may also be true for some other companies in telecoms, but for BT that doesn't apply. So it's an imprecise sort of approach to measuring scope 3. It's the best practice there is at the moment, and I think all companies are working to improve that, and ultimately that means sort of working more closely with your suppliers to understand better what your specific sort of supply chain looks like.
Thank you, Andy. Just in terms of how then we're looking to reduce our supply chain carbon emissions, got 14,000 direct suppliers, global spend of about 14 billion. We have been a member of the CDP supply chain program since its inception, so that's over 10 years now. That's been something that we found very, very useful in terms of getting suppliers really onto the whole climate agenda. We also use CDP data to substitute in where we can. So instead of using, industry average numbers, we substitute in actual reporting data so that we can see supply chain carbon reduction. We can reflect what our suppliers are actually doing. We also have in the past and are planning to do again to write out to our suppliers to encourage them to buy renewables and to set net zero targets. We have introduced a contract clause. So when we are negotiating a general contract with some of our bigger strategic suppliers, we basically say, oh, well, by the way, if you want this business from BT, we have a new clause. That means that over the term of the contract, you need to also reduce your carbon emissions. I think what this has done, it's been quite useful in elevating the discussion on climate and carbon from sustainability teams to actually being more of the executive agenda and being part of a contract. We work also with our suppliers on innovation. We run something we call the game-changing challenge, which is basically we ask suppliers to come in and pitch ideas around sustainability. So they could be around product design, around packaging, around logistics, and they come in and present their idea to a panel of BT judges, and we then declare a winner, and we look to work with the winning company to take that proposal forward. I think another important aspect for us in what we do is that we open source our approach. So the way we think about our scope 3 supply chain accounting, our emissions, and the slide, the pie chart that Andy spoke to, all that's public. Our methodology has been public from the beginning. All our end-to-end carbon accounts are actually on our public website, and that's just an upload from the team, from the actual spreadsheet that they work on. And I think we found it really useful in things that we are doing today, and we're very grateful for GSMA to bring together companies like this to talk about our approaches and to learn from what each other are doing. So this is my third session today, and it's been really interesting and really useful. I think that's it from me.
Great. Thanks very much, Gabrielle. Fantastic, the work that BT has done on both calculating supply chain emissions and also engaging your supply chain, and those really interesting metrics around how you engage through CDP in particular. Let's see if there's any questions. So let's open it up to the floor. So feel free to either speak your question or you can type it into the chat box.
Hi, I'm Rocio Rojas from America Mobile, and thank you very much for the presentation. I just have a quick question regarding how specific are you being in the clauses integrated in the contracts?
So not very specific, if I'm honest. So we basically say pretty much over the term of the contract, BT will work with the suppliers to reduce their carbon emissions. We don't say a percentage. We don't say a specific area. So it's more, I think, as we all know, on sustainability, it's about learning together, and I always seen it as as collaboration. So we will work with the company to look at identifying a project that affects BT, measuring a baseline, and then work together with them actually. What are some of the improvements that they can make and suggestions. So we do try to make this as collaborative as we can, rather than saying you must do this specifically, because situations also, of course, with suppliers are very different. So you can't just do one size fits all, really. That we found that just doesn't work. So it's something that we try to do together and learn together from.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Good evening. I am Ashok Srivastav from Reliance Jio from Mumbai. I have one query to discuss with you regarding this end-to-end carbon footprint, cadence and CO2 emission of this part of that MBM, market-based method for scope 2 emission, just refer as a category number 1. And last point is mentioned is a point number 12, end of life treatment of sold product. Can you brief how it will be helpful for the reduction of carbon emissions and end to end of the supply chain engagement?
Yeah, do we go to you first, Andy, about the market-based method and why companies might be using it?
Yeah. So the mark, I think as most people probably know, there's two ways of measuring Scope 2 emissions that can be either market-based or location-based. Location-based simply uses the grid average for a country, and the market-based reflects specific emissions that you purchase. Specific electricity, the emissions of the electricity that you purchase from a specific supplier, and reflects that. So whether it's through specific instruments, through RECs, REGOs, or through a PPA agreement. And so that means that if you as a company can buy sort of low carbon or renewable electricity, then you can get the credit for it under the market-based approach. So most companies, particularly in the telecoms sector or the ICT sector, where electricity is a big component, then they will report against the market-based approach. So according to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, you should report both market-based and location-based so that people can see how you've assessed what your emissions are. For when it's applying to Scope 3 emissions, then you tend to use the grid average because, for example, the use of sold products category is your customer's use of equipment that you sell to them, and you won't necessarily know what their electricity that they're using. So you would for that use the grid average, the location based. So I don't know if that specifically answers that particularly. And then I think the other question was around the end of life for Scope 3 category. So that's, again, that's products that you sell, that the customers buy. So like handsets is an obvious example. And at the end of the life of that product, what happens to it and what emissions are associated with it. So for most electronic goods, there's no sort of direct release of emissions into the atmosphere. It's not like paper or compostables, which release methane or CO2 into the atmosphere. It's more the energy used to either refurbishing or recycling those products or transporting them. So that's usually very, very small compared to everything else. And the way most companies estimate that is to look at the total products that are sold and apply an end-of-life emission factor related to those products. Not sure if that's completely captured the question correctly. I think that's what I understood you were asking.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stephen. Only the point is that, as you have told, this product has to be sold, but this is also included in Scope 3 Category 1, purchase goods and services, and Scope 3 Category 2, capital goods. So on that part, if we can take together, it has to be, it will not come in the market-based method for Scope 2 emissions accounting. So that's my query is there, how it has to be brief descriptive to make more effective for the carbon emissions end-to-end of the footprint.
So the category 1 and 2 are things that you buy from your suppliers. So I'm not clear how that's relating to the electricity consumption.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay,
I see, Stephen. There's some questions in the chat box. So I will let Andy think about the first one, and I will look at the second one, which is, given the big numbers of suppliers, how do you manage to engage them all, and do we focus on a certain category? Yes, you can imagine we can't engage with all of our suppliers. We tend to look at it in terms of spend. So if we look at BT's top 40 suppliers, that's 50% of our spend and 60% of our supply chain carbon emissions. If we look at our top 50, that becomes 53% of spend and 63% of carbon. So these tend to be the very large suppliers that we've had, year-long relationships with. I'm sure we all I'm sure, share some of those suppliers. So that will be the big mobile handset manufacturers or the big network equipment manufacturers. So we focus, for example, our contract clause on discussions with those suppliers. We also, yes, do look at, when we look at SME suppliers, we do look at certain categories where we think that there might be large carbon emissions. We're also going to start looking at another project with the Carbon Trust as well, focusing on SMEs and trying to figure out through audits and interviews with SMEs where, in which category we can actually make the most impact, and then to look at sharing case studies around that. So it's been very much a focus around our top strategic partners, but we have written out to certain others through CDPs. And one of the things, of course, we also have to do, which is part of our supply chain program, is get our suppliers to talk to their suppliers. So I think that's very important. So if we, again, as through GSMA and working together, if we can influence, part of the supply chain, and they in turn can influence theirs. Okay, so then I'm just going to ask this second question, and then leave two to Andy. So how do we? What do we do with that?
We'll just pick up the first question, actually. Andy, if you just answer the first question.
Sorry.
In the interest of time, we'll then move on to Andy's presentation. We can pick up some questions at the end if there's still time.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Sorry, Gabrielle. So Andy, absolute versus relative.
Yeah. So there's sort of different ways of setting a Scope 3 target under the Science Based Target Initiative. You can set an absolute reduction, a relative reduction, or you can set an engagement target. And some companies will actually set a combination of those. So it might be for different parts of the Scope 3 emissions. So, for example, for the supply chain, could be a supplier engagement target. For the use of sold products, it could be an absolute reduction. And it partly depends on sort of the number of suppliers you've got, to sort of what percentage of those suppliers contribute what size of emissions. As Gabrielle's just explained, they have a large number of thousands of suppliers. Some companies have tens of thousands of suppliers, and so it's what's actually practical to achieve. And for the Sbti criteria, you have 2/3 of your total Scope 3 emissions have to be covered under the Scope 3 target, but they could be separated out. The difference between absolute and relative is the Sbti basically recommend you to do an absolute target, and they almost penalise you for a relative one. You have to define a metric which is representative. And if some companies, you could use a financial metric, but then you have to set a much higher percentage reduction to compensate because of the variability of that might happen. So again, most companies will choose an absolute target. One is because it's simpler to communicate and to measure, but it does mean if you've got a changing business, then it might be more appropriate to look at a relative target. So in interest of time and letting Andy Murray have his half hour exactly, then we should probably move on there.
Andy's got a bit less than that, actually, because
you've got to talk as well.
Yeah, there's the third one as well. But thanks very much both, Gabrielle and Andy, and hopefully we'll have some time to come back to the last two questions that are on the chat as well. But yeah, if I could hand over to you, Andy, if you want to share your screen.
Great, thank you all. Yeah, it was really interesting. Hopefully you guys can see my screen.
Yes, that's coming through.
Perfect. So Andy Murray in Vodafone Group, working in the Sustainable Business team. If this lets me, here we go. So yeah, similar format to Gabrielle's, a bit of a timeline. yeah, we first started assessing and reporting carbon way back in 2001. However, it took until 2016 until we did a full Scope 3 analysis and reporting. Prior to that, we only touched on the categories that we either had good data or were quite material, things like business travel. And you see that's quite a long time. So over the last 4 years, the actual importance of Scope 3 has really risen up on the kind of agenda across the company and the outside world. We now have investors and the kind of wider ecosystem understanding Scope 3 more and understanding why it's important to act. We have a number of targets in this area, which all fall under our planet pillar, which is part of our purpose to improve 1 billion lives and halve our environmental impact by 2025. These targets are quite short, and we're kind of focusing on the 2025 targets at the moment to ensure that we're addressing our immediate impact. We are getting close to publishing a public science-based target aligned to a 1.5 degree world, which will, as Andy Stevens described, have to include a Scope 3 emissions reduction target because it's much greater than 40%. We've been working on Scope 3 for much longer than that. This will just be a public commitment on a set target moving out into the future. So if you look at our footprint, you'll see on the graph on the left, our Scope 1 emissions and Scope 2 emissions, so the blue parts of that donut, are very small relative to our total Scope 3. And again, your Scope 1 and 2 will be quite relatively easy to reduce. Scope 2 are 100% renewables. We'll tackle this. It's worth mentioning that Vodafone is a global telco with operations predominantly in Europe and Africa, but also a number of joint ventures, especially Vodafone Idea in India, Vodafone Hutchinson in Australia, Safaricom, Ziggo. So we have a series of these investments and joint ventures where we are no longer in operational control. So they don't sit within our Scope 1 and 2 emissions anymore. They sit in our Scope 3, which is why if you look at the pie chart on the right, we have a predominantly very large investments category within our Scope 3 emissions. And this is predominantly driven by our investment in India, which is a very large market and a very high carbon intensity market due to the amount of diesel on the grid and the carbon emission factor associated with the electricity use there. So unlike BT, we have this additional chunk at the top, which is our investments. But then very similar, our next most material section of a category of Scope 3 is purchased goods and services, which comes out at just under a third. Again, this is due to all the goods and products we buy, as well as the kind of services around advertisement, legal fees, everything we spend money on wrapped up into there. Then the kind of third and the other most material issue is, again, use of sold products. And this is predominantly fixed line, but also mobiles, which are constantly on in people's houses, constantly drawing power. So if you have a large number of internet routers, although individually they're small, when you do the sums, actually they're a very significant proportion of our wider Scope 3 emissions. We don't report on all 15 categories. We did a scoping exercise to scope out those which were either immaterial or we had kind of low influenceability over, or were not areas we felt we should focus on. I'll touch on that later. However, we do still include some categories that, even though they're very, very small relative to everything else, we still want to measure them, report them, and take action on them because we can, and that's where we can drive change. And again, this is business travel, leased assets, and waste generated. So again, I'll touch on this on the next slide. These are our categories that we included even though they're not material. So the kind of big three, the big chunks, the joint ventures, the use of products, and the purchased goods and services, clearly you need to include them because they are by far the most majority of your Scope 3 emissions. Now, if you look in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, it provides some advice and guidance on how to scope out your Scope 3 emissions, because sometimes some categories either just don't apply to you or they're so small that relative to everything else, they fall out of the materiality assessment. the way we've focused is either if they're material, so they're significantly large, or if we have influenceability. If you can, we consider influenceability on kind of two different ways. Whether we influence it, so it's something we can directly change, impact, and reduce, or whether there's an external influence that's much greater that will drive all the change. So if there's a category which we have very little influence over, but is all the change over the coming years is influenced by an external force, us reporting, measuring, and driving that change will have very little impact. It will decarbonize because of that external force. On the other end, if there are things that we have strong ability to influence, for example, business travel, that's purely our choices and how we engage business, even though it's very small relative to the rest of our Scope 3, it's still worth including so we can measure it, report it, and really drive that change down. I'd also like to note that, again, data and data accuracy is a real challenge. On some of these, it's quite hard to have an accurate picture of your Scope 3 and relies upon the methods discussed earlier, be it spend and average values, or pulling that data out of the company and trying to get hold of data where you don't have ownership of it can be a challenge. So that's half of the effort, is to get hold of good data so you can really accurately measure, report, and move forward. So moving into kind of the wider Scope 3 and the target of all this and our internal targets and everyone's external targets are to reduce carbon emissions. Now, it's worth noting that this isn't going to be done by Vodafone, this isn't going to be done by BT, it's going to be done by everyone within the industry and outside the industry. National targets, improvements in efficiency, price changes for renewable energy versus carbon intensive energy. All of these roll up into a reduction. So actually, the ability to influence and change your Scope 3 is partly your efforts and your process, and partly that by the outside world, which you can support and influence and change. So it's always worth considering when you see these big scary numbers and it's how do we tackle this? Actually, half of that work is already going to be done for you. For example, use of sold products. As Europe, which is most of our fixed line business, decarbonizes, that energy that people use to power their routers that we report as carbon goes to zero when a nation reaches 100% renewable electricity. So therefore, that will reduce quite rapidly by itself. What we can do is offer better, higher, more efficient routers to reduce that total electricity demand, and then we can both work together to reduce that carbon emission quite quickly. So in the supply chain, which is the kind of most of our company's largest and most challenging area to work with, it's worth remembering that passive saving that's there. We all, a lot of us in the telco industry have targets, but so do a lot of the tech companies and do a lot of our suppliers. We think it's quite a small number of suppliers for network equipment. A lot of them are large companies with their own science-based targets, either existing or hopefully soon to be announced. And then they also have to tackle their Scope 1 and 2 and hopefully 3, which then passes it down the chain again. So a lot of the savings is driven by the collective effort, of which the more active you can be and looking at the levers you have and how much you can pull those levers helps to really shift that forward. So there are a number of challenges, and we'll admit to them, and we share these challenges openly to try and work through solutions together. And that's around kind of who owns the data and who owns the reduction in your carbon. Is it your sustainability team, your energy team, your procurement team, or is it the company you're buying from? Everyone has a different level of input in the process, and it's worth having everyone aligned to a single target and agreed importance of carbon. And again, bringing in the CEO remuneration is a really good way, because if the CEO is getting paid, then that filters down to everyone, and the more performance you have on sustainability and carbon and energy, everyone gets meets their targets, they all get paid their bonuses, everyone's happy. So it's really engaging and driving that kind of, it isn't owned by anyone, it's owned by the company, and it's owned by the choices we make. There is a challenge around the modelling. A lot of modelling is still done on spend and economic input-output factors. the shift to more accurate life cycle assessment values, so you're really accurately representing who you choose to buy with and who you choose to work with, is slowly getting better. And I think that's an area of growth over the next 10 years, so we can accurately report the specific choices you make in your purchasing decisions to reflect those actions you're encouraging and both reflect back the changes industry is making, especially if you're putting a lot of effort and weighting into it. So our RFQ process has a weighting for purpose, which includes carbon emissions as well as kind of diversity and inclusion topics. We want to reflect that in our data because we only want to work with companies and we only award money to companies who are taking action in this area. And that's all about our ability to engage and influence. And likewise to Gabrielle, there is a number of kind of legal clauses in our contracts around energy efficiency, renewable energy, carbon targets. Same when we onboard companies, we check that have got carbon targets and environmental attributes that we like. And again, working with the CDP to collect the data, they all reinforce each other. And it means you've got that ability to shift and change. And every step of the journey, your supply chain is being told the same message that, you know, carbon emissions are good, carbon reductions are good, you'll win more business, you'll perform better in the view of the company who's purchasing from you. That is then great. Another one we're trying to look at now is how we can encourage the SBTI process of science-based target setting, which again aligns to the kind of GSMA overarching strategy, that the more of the industry that sets science-based targets, the more that then cascades down to the next level and the next level. If everyone has a science-based target aligned to 1.5 degree world, everyone's working to the same hymn sheet, so to speak, to the same reduction pathway, we'll all achieve the same level of decarbonisation that we've set in our targets, and we all win, and the world wins. And then finally, there's a shift coming out of COVID, and there's a lot of talk, especially for us who have a strong European base, around the globalization and the re-onshoring of industrial manufacturing. Can we encourage a shift away from high carbon, low cost manufacturing locations to a much more lower carbon, higher environmental standard, either through raising the standards where things are being built or encouraging manufacturing to go to places that maybe have more red tape, but has better standards and lower carbon emissions. So in interest of time, I'll stop there to leave some time for questions and for Stephen.
Thank you very much, Andy. I appreciate you giving a bit of an overview as well, and the kind of the purpose behind a lot of this strategy that we're involved in, and some of the positive aspects that we don't always talk about of what others do that help us with these targets. Actually, a question's coming from Sudhir at Reliance, which is along the same lines as Simon's question before, which is probably both for you and Gabrielle. How do you measure carbon reduction in purchased goods and services? So that kind of big category that make up a sizable chunk of Scope 3 emissions.
Yeah, so at the moment we do an annual Scope 3 carbon emission assessment based upon our spend in the previous year and using mostly economic input-output factors, which is a carbon emissions per dollar of spend on a certain type of product. So different products have different carbon intensities and we reflect it that way. Now, as I kind of alluded to, that's an average value, which is great and does decarbonize slowly as everyone shifts, but doesn't quite capture the engagement we have and the products we're really driving and the RFQ process where we're only selecting the most efficient, lowest carbon vendors. So we're looking to slowly increase the number of life cycle assessment values you can get in there, the accuracy of data, to bring in bespoke carbon emission calculations for our big spend categories to really more accurately reflect that. Because at the moment it's good, but it's not great. And as more people do this and that data becomes more standardized, we'll be able to get there. That's Vodafone's approach anyway. But yeah, it is a challenge to get that data. And again, you'd love to do it quarterly, but it's just too much of an effort.
I would agree. So yeah, so we do something similar on an annual annual basis as well, and looking at the same approaches.
Great. Yes, it becomes a bit more of a hybrid approach. You're taking
Exactly.
economic
Yeah.
input output plus
Yeah.
supplier specific data where you engage with those suppliers.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. There was one question actually from Gaurav earlier. Given the end-to-end supply chain, what are the key initiatives in the field of product storage, warehousing, and distribution? I don't know whether you've got any. It's quite a specific question, but whether you've got any examples of key. I presume these are carbon reduction initiatives in the field of product storage, warehousing, and distribution.
We've got a good example. So one way to reduce your scope 3 on supply chain is to spend less money. If you're buying less stuff, you're creating less carbon. So we have an internal asset marketplace where we look across our footprint, and it's only in a few markets, but we're rolling it out to more and more markets. And we say we have spare 4G equipment that we bought in the UK, which we don't need. However, in Albania, we're looking to install the same 4G equipment. Now, previously, the UK would keep their equipment and, okay, it's a bit of an excess spare or it's stuff we've removed from the existing network. Let's just keep it in a warehouse. We might need it. But now, Albania's first port of call is checking this global marketplace we have, all the assets in place, and they can then purchase that equipment we already own, and then we'll sort out the arranging of the shipping and the transport to that market. So rather than buying new equipment, we can remove legacy equipment from older networks or spares or excess stock we have and trade it internally and have the right trading in terms of value as well across the market to reduce that direct demand to buy new equipment. And that's one of the kind of the strongest levers we've got, because it reduces the original demand, it saves us money, and it saves the environment from having to create new product. So I'd say that is a very useful one that we have developed internally, and we're hoping to roll out further and further.
Great, thank you. This might be a question for Andy from Wilfred, and which we've sort of covered off in the presentations, but maybe you'd like to recap, Andy. Which criteria is used to decide the Scope 3 categories to report on? Sorry, Andy Stevens, not Andy Murray, Andy Stevens. Maybe Andy Stevens, you'd like to explain that.
Yeah. So Andy Murray, it's very confusing. Andy Murray did sort of cover this briefly. So obviously material, well, things that are material you need to report, and the sort of exclusion criteria that you can, if they're sort of de minimis, which typically means less than 1% of the total, then you don't need to report it. Although in order to demonstrate it's less than 1%, you need to have at least roughly calculated it. So companies usually do a hotspot analysis of all the categories to decide which ones are material and not. And then some will report all 15 anyway, even if they're very minor. Some may group all the small ones into one category to report. So the key thing is, if they're at all material, then you need to report them. That's the key thing.
Great. Thanks, Andy. Gabrielle, a question for you from Jayang at SK. It's around excluding category 15, so the investment category.
I actually know the answer because I have the cheat sheet from the Carbon Trust. It says, when material, we include this in our Scope 1 and 2 reporting. A study carried out by the Carbon Trust found that 99% of BT's investments were accounted for under Scopes 1 and 2. So we have accounted for them already, I guess, Andy Stevens, which is why we exclude them here.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, BT is a very different situation from Vodafone. You don't have joint ventures in different countries in the same way that Vodafone does. So the investments will be quite small. So some companies it's just not applicable, category 15. Some it may be joint ventures is usually the main one, but there may also be where you've got financial investments, sort of cash investments. Then you do need to look at those.
Perfect. Thank you.
One is a very important question is there. How to measure carbon reduction in purchased goods and services? That is a very important part for the scope 3.
Yes,
How
that's
to
a
measure?
question that
How
that's
to
a
measure?
question that we've just covered. We've covered off that question already.
Its clarity is not there. Na? And this we have not received the clarity of that subject. Purchase good, how you have to measure this all?
Is there anything that Andy or Gabriel you'd like to add on measuring carbon reduction in purchased goods and services?
I think, I mean, to summarize, that there's the economic spend approach, there's life cycle assessment approach, and then there's using supplier specific either data or life cycle or supplier emissions. So those are the main areas, and you can get more granularity depending on how much data you've got. So most companies start with the more average approach, but then they work through the more detail as they establish sort of what are the most significant impacts, and the changes will be reflected depending on which methodology you use.
Yes, maybe if I can kind of give an example from us. So one of our biggest spend is on Apple iPhones because we get a lot of Apple iPhones, we pass them on to our customers. Now, each year when we do our Scope 3 purchase goods and services assessment, we look at how much we spent on Apple iPhones, and then we look at what type of iPhone that is, and then we look at the Apple carbon factor that says an iPhone is 67 grams of carbon. And then we say, okay, this year there is 1 million tons from Apple iPhones. Now, next year, say Apple improved that iPhone's carbon footprint and it drops from 67 kilograms to 50, and we do that same calculation, that will have then dropped that 17 kgs per phone. We might only be 900,000 tons of carbon emissions. So therefore, we can report that drop in carbon in our following year's carbon assessment. Scale that up by everything you spend on, and you got your answer. Again, very complicated and hard to do, so you focus on the biggest parts.
It's funny you should say that, Andy Mary. We use that same example with Apple.
Everyone knows an Apple, that's the thing, right?
Yeah.
Good. Thanks both. Any other questions for Andy and Gabrielle? Okay. Well, in the interest of time, and that we are cutting things quite fine, we might overshoot a little bit. Let me just share my screen. So hopefully that's come through. I just go back to the beginning. Great. So I thought I'd give you an update at an industry level on what's happening around supply chain and supplier engagement, because there are a few different things going on. So this is particularly focused on this area of the overall climate action plan for this year. And if we've kind of already covered this, so I won't labour the point, but obviously Scope 3 emissions are particularly important for us as an industry because they are, in general, the majority of our emissions. So our Scope 1 and our Scope 2 emissions actually form a minority of our overall emissions. In terms of calculating, again, we've kind of covered this off in quite a lot of detail, but this is just to make the point again that it is more of an estimation at the moment. The two biggest areas to focus on when you're looking at it are from purchased goods and services, which we've just talked about quite a lot, and also the use of sold products, which we've also touched on as well. It is more estimation than calculation, and hybrid approaches, as Andy and Gabrielle have just talked about, do improve the accuracy of your Scope 3 emissions calculations. If you'd like more guidance on this, there is quite a lot to go through actually in the Setting Climate Targets, the guidance that we produced earlier this year, which talk about how to calculate and estimate Scope 3 emissions, and also give you some useful tools in the appendices of that. So external tools that you can use to do things like the environmental input-output assessment, so using your procurement spend to estimate what the carbon emissions are in your supply chain. There are lots of useful links in there. Please take a look through. It will be very useful to help you model your Scope 3 emissions. So how can we address them? I mean, these are things that we've kind of touched on actually in the previous two presentations. But there are things that we can do both individually as companies, but also at an industry level. So in terms of upstream, your supplier emissions, first of all, just understanding, estimating, calculating where your emissions sit is obviously the beginning of then being able to target those sources of emissions that are particularly large. So that helps you to understand maybe which suppliers you should be having specific conversations with, because they form a very big part of your procurement spend, or because what they supply to you is quite carbon intensive. So a consultancy spend, for example, is less carbon intensive than you purchasing a manufactured product in general, for example. So that estimation, that calculation, that looking at where your Scope 3 emissions sit, then helps you narrow down and understand which companies, types of companies, which suppliers you can then perhaps do some more targeted engagement with. And that's the second point here. So supplier engagement. So we have heard from the presenters today that they engage in specific supplier engagement. Whether that's directly, whether that's through the CDP supply chain program, whether that's through running competitions with their suppliers to encourage them to engage, whether that's through procurement and putting clauses in contracts. There's lots of different things that you can do to engage your suppliers around this. One of the most important things is to get them to disclose what their carbon emissions are, either directly to you through clauses in your procurement contracts, or to get them to disclose them publicly, which a lot of the big suppliers are already doing, for example, through the CDP or through their sustainability reporting each year. That also then leads on to target setting. Andy Murray was making the great point that the more that we can get our suppliers behind target setting, the more it helps us achieve our own targets. So we set our own science-based targets and then encourage our tier 1 suppliers to set their own SBTs. They then encourage their tier 1 suppliers to set their own SBTs. That cascades back, and then everyone's pulling in the same direction. The third area, which is possibly more challenging at an individual level, and is something that we perhaps engage slightly more in at the GSMA and industry level, is around policy advocacy. So that's actually engaging more in understanding at a country level, and through things like the new climate policy that we've developed, the challenges that we have around reducing carbon emissions in our supply chain. And that's very often due to the fact that we are importing them from countries with more intense levels of greenhouse gas emissions than we do. So it's important to communicate that so that we can start to influence and encourage those particular countries and the governments in those countries and the policy frameworks, so that they are encouraged to decarbonize in their country, because that will help us decarbonize our supply chain. Downstream, again, estimation is important.
Has joined the conference.
Customer engagement as well is something that we can do to talk to customers about reducing their carbon emissions by doing things like switching to renewable electricity. And then device sustainability is also important. So making more energy efficient devices obviously helps reduce your downstream customer emissions. So what are we doing at an industry level? What is the GSMA doing? So we took part in the CDP supply chain program this year, and we did it for a number of different reasons. It will help us to begin to estimate what the supply chain emissions are from key suppliers. So those suppliers that have responded to us through the CDP. It is useful to encourage key suppliers across the industry to begin to disclose not only what their carbon emissions are, but also what their climate strategies are, because the CDP questionnaire goes beyond just asking what your carbon emissions are. It asks you what targets you're setting. It asks you how you're implementing an evaluation of climate risk into your business strategy. It asks a whole host of questions. It's useful for identifying which suppliers have science-based targets and which do not. Those that have science-based targets that are already aligned to net zero, 1.5 degree targets, we don't really have to focus on those because they're already doing what we need them to do. But we can therefore look to decide which suppliers don't, and therefore which it will be better to spend time engaging. And then we also ultimately need to understand how on track we are to achieve net zero emissions as an industry by 2050, which is obviously the commitment that the GSMA has made and the GSMA board to move the industry to net zero. A key part of this is the GSMA's engagement with JAC, the Joint Audit Cooperation. So the Joint Audit Cooperation audits common suppliers across the mobile industry on sustainability. It's got membership of 17 major operator groups, and it does work with hundreds of suppliers. So we entered into an MOU with JAC at the end of last year, and we're working together on climate action in particular, and also human rights. So far, we've run an Introduction to Climate webinar with CDP, and that was explaining what emission scopes are and also climate reporting. And we're planning to have further sessions on setting climate targets later this year. So it's a good way for us to engage with a lot of suppliers all at the same time through one organization. I also wanted to talk about the Eco Rating Initiative, which is something else that's potentially very important actually for helping to reduce the carbon emissions of our industry. This has been developed to offer consumers a choice around the sustainability of handsets that they buy. It's operator-led initiative, so original operators were Orange, Telefonica, Deutsche Telekom, and they've just undergone a pilot with 10 vendors. 25 phones were evaluated as part of that. The pilot vendors you can see at the bottom of the screen, and we're just evaluating the results of that pilot at the moment and tweaking the methodology. The aim is to create an eco rating for new handsets that can be applied. So a new handset will go through an assessment and it will provide an eco rating for that handset, and that will therefore enable customers to decide to choose their handset based on sustainability and environmental criteria. It's something that we think is particularly important as well, because we'd like to keep ahead of regulation on this. The European Commission is actually looking at the sustainability of handsets at the moment. It's quite possible that they will look to introduce regulation in this area. Though it's good that we get ahead of that and we actually create an industry initiative that we've developed rather than having it developed for us. And the final point is kind of a bit of good news. And we kind of touched upon this earlier, but this is around Apple and Microsoft and two very big announcements that they've made recently. And firstly, Apple committed to be carbon neutral for their supply chain and products by 2030, sorry. They are a big part of our supply chain, so that's fantastic news for us because it really helps us reduce our supplier emissions. Microsoft as well committed to be carbon negative by 2030. Not so much a big part of our supply chain, but also in the ICT sector, and very useful for inspiring and encouraging other companies to follow their lead. So it helps us in terms of setting our science-based targets for suppliers, and it also helps us to achieve them. So that was a very quick rattle through, but welcome any comments or questions. Sorry, we're a little bit over time, so appreciate you staying with us. Defile, yes, I just seen we will share the presentations as well. Okay. Okay, great. If there are no questions, then thank you very much to Gabrielle, to Andy, and to Andy for your time today, and also for everyone on the call for your contributions.